Thank you for the invite. My name's Nick Spencer. I'm Senior Fellow at THEOS. I've been doing that for 17 years now. THEOS is a Christian think tank. We were launched in November 2006. We were launched with the support of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, but I'm always at pains to emphasise it was with the warm spiritual support of both of them rather than the hard financial support of either of them. And we are actually independent of any particular Christian denomination or church. We exist really to tell a better story about faith in general, Christianity specifically in contemporary public life, better in two senses of the word, really. Firstly, more accurate. There's an awful lot of misinformation that flies around about faith in public today, and research is therefore at the heart of what we do. We commission quite a lot of research, examining, as it were, the status and the position and the role of faith in contemporary, mainly British public life. But it's also better, hopefully, in the sense of more attractive, more winsome, more cogent, more persuasive, more coherent. Our audience really is for what's sometimes known as the public square, anyone who's interested in debate on public issues and has a view on faith, and most people do, and that's the audience we try to speak to. We cover a whole range of different subjects. I won't even bother listing them now because it will take most of the next 45 minutes. But if you're interested, the website is theosthinktank.co.uk, where you can download reports and listen to podcasts and read blogs and do other interesting things like that. I'm going to speak to you about science and religion because it's a topic that I have been on and off working for quite a long time now. I did a lot of work back in 2009 with the big Darwin anniversary. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working on a bigger, more generic project on science and religion, largely because, to quote from the title we have tonight, people think there is a problem. Now, it's very often the case when Christians hear that, they automatically leap into the, no, there's not a problem at all. And I don't think that's very helpful. As it happens, I think that science and religion, although a great deal depends on what you actually mean by those terms, work together very well for the majority of the time. I think there are some tension points, and I think they're some of the most interesting ones. But I think it's incumbent on us to be honest and open and truthful in this debate rather than automatically leap to a kind of defensive position. And that's what I want to do tonight. I want to talk a little bit about primarily the history of science and religion, because I published a book this year called Magisteria, The Entangled Histories of Science and Religion, which tells the story from about 2,000 years ago, roughly, right the way up to today. And then end on just a couple of thoughts about where we're looking in the 21st century and why, in particular, this whole science and religion debate, I think, is going to be incredibly important over the coming century, but not for the slightly kind of old neuralgic reasons that we're often led to believe, not because of fundamentalism, creationism, evolution, cosmology, Big Bang, all interesting subjects. Actually, I think they're really peripheral to where the serious and interesting debate is on this one. And I hope what I've got to say will persuade you similarly. I'll speak for 35 minutes, I guess, something like that. But hopefully it'll provoke some questions and we can have a good debate and discussion afterwards. On Saturday, the 30th of June, 1860, Oxford University experienced a very Oxford kind of a riot. The scene was the library of the new University Museum, which was the only building in the city that could accommodate the 800 or so spectators who were there to witness this punch-up. The occasion was, in theory, a lecture on, quote, the intellectual development of Europe by an American academic. But as everyone knew, in reality, it was a debate about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection that had been published 9 months earlier. And the protagonists, the real protagonists, were Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, and Thomas Huxley, who was subsequently to become known to history as Darwin's bulldog. Now, the Huxley-Wilberforce debate has passed into legend, almost the British equivalent of the Galileo trial 250 years earlier. Unfortunately, in this particular case, our sources are a bit more fragmentary than they are with Galileo. And what we know about this debate had to be pieced together from a handful of newspaper accounts and a few gossipy letters. What appears to have happened is that Wilberforce made a facetious remark about whether Huxley would prefer to have been descended from an ape on his grandmother or his grandfather's side. And Huxley responded that he would prefer to be descended from an ape than a bishop, or something to that effect. Either way, the audience response was riotous. Gentlemen jumped out of their seats, and at least one audience member, Jane Purnell, the Lady Brewster, apparently fainted. The encounter went down as a scientific drubbing of religion, another victory in the eternal war between truth and obscurantism, between fact and faith, between science and religion. Except for the fact that it didn't at the time. And it seems to have faded away from memory for decades until it was resurrected and embellished at the end of the century. In actual fact, the most important person on the stage at the time, when it comes to what we think about science and religion, was the man whose lecture Wilberforce and Huxley were, in theory, responding to. His name was John William Draper. He was the son of a convert to Methodism, and back to Methodist minister. And he had emigrated to America in his 20s, and he had become an eminent chemist and the first president of the American Chemical Association. But Draper also considered himself to be something of an intellectual historian. And it was he who delivered what was, by all accounts, a very dull lecture that hot June afternoon before Wilberforce and Huxley took the ring. Draper, interestingly, never mentioned this allegedly legendary debate in his later writings, which is another reason to think it actually wasn't such a big deal at the time, as we now assume. But he did do something rather more important 15 years later, when he published a history of, as he put it, the conflict between science and religion, which put forward a highly selective and tendentious narrative of the relationship between science and religion over the previous 2,000 years. You see, John William Draper had inherited his father's anti-Catholicism, and his book struck a very powerful chord within an American Protestant audience that was very worried at the time about Vatican authoritarianism and about levels of Catholic immigration. Not surprisingly, the conflict that Draper had picked out between science and religion was actually between science and the Catholic Church, and he didn't have that much to say about orthodoxy or Protestantism or Islam. But it was his book, his very popular book, with another one published 20 years later by a historian called Andrew Dixon White, that formed the basis of the false history that science and religion, most people believe of science and religion today. It's really important to emphasize this. If you were to go back 160 or 70 years now, certainly 200 years plus, and you had posited to people at the time that there was a conflict between science and religion, they literally wouldn't have understood what you were talking about, not least because the categories of science and religion only really became established in their modern format in the mid-19th century. For much of the time beforehand, people didn't talk about science and religion, or at least not in the way that we do, and they would not have understood the idea that there was a systemic conflict between the two. And yet, because of the way that Draper and White have popularized this idea, it got passed into the popular bloodstream, and it has become established. We at THEOS published some research we conducted with YouGov a few years ago, which asked a whole range of questions, one of which was about people's perception of science and religion. And by and large, by a proportion of 2 to 1, the British public believes that science and religion are in tension or conflict with one another rather than in harmony. That's the public view, however. In the academic world of science and religion, and particularly in the academic world of the history of science and religion, that view is not held anymore. A whole host of scholars have been working at this coalface and have pointed out that the true history of science and religion was nothing like as oppositional and conflictual as Draper and White claimed. And actually, for most of the time, science and religion have been pretty happy bedfellows. Characters like John Henley Brooke and Bernie Lightman and Ron Numbers and Peter Harrison, who are very well known and very well respected in the academy, have shown very conclusively that not only are these terms anachronistic, but if you go through the history of science and religion right up to the present, there hasn't been a problem. It's just that it's got lodged in the public mind that there is. The truth is that for pretty much any era in history, you can find religious characters vociferously defending and often leading the scientific enterprise of the day, at the same time as you can hear others critiquing it. So many of the stories that we have just assumed as true today either aren't true or are simply much more complicated than we make out. So here are a few of the better known examples. Nicholas Copernicus, who first put forward a systemic idea of heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth orbits the sun rather than the other way around, never imagined that that theory was a threat to his faith. Actually, nor did anybody else in the 1520s and 30s and early 1540s when he put it forward. He was reluctant to publish, but his reluctance to publish was entirely down to the weaknesses of his arguments at the time, and not because of fear of papal or ecclesiastical persecution. In fact, the very earliest documents show that the papacy embraced the idea of heliocentrism with some reservations quite enthusiastically. Almost nobody thought that decentering the Earth demoted human beings. That was an idea that Sigmund Freud put forward 300 years later, the idea that if you removed the Earth from the center of the cosmos, all of a sudden human beings weren't central to the cosmos and weren't important anymore. Nobody at the time actually thought that was the case. That was a much later Freudian invention. The very obvious friction that there was about heliocentrism between Galileo and the church, or Galileo and the papacy, was actually primarily about the status of Aristotle, the leading philosopher used for Catholic theology at the time, within Catholic theology, as well as the fear that the papacy had of threats from new Protestant reformations, not to mention an old standing animus between Galileo and his friend who became Pope Urban VIII. There was tension there, but the idea that it was simply about science is totally anachronistic. The scientific revolution itself, I'll put that in inverted commas, from the 17th century, was heavily founded on the idea that the human mind, like the human soul, is fallen. That means you couldn't trust the human mind simply to rationally think its way to the truth. You had to feel your way to the truth. You had to experience your way to the truth. Or to use another word, you had to experiment your way to the truth. There are some profound theological justifications beneath the scientific evolution. The oldest and arguably the most important scientific society in the world, the Royal Society in London, when it was founded, was absolutely not anti-religious, as some people have claimed. It was simply founded in the middle of the 17th century after a decade or two of religiously inflected wars, and they didn't want to get dragged into those kind of theological debates. Isaac Newton wrote considerably more about theology, which he considered to be much more important than he did about science, although it's fair to say that he was quite unorthodox in his theological views. Most of the early work done in the science of geology was conducted by Anglican clergymen at the beginning of the 19th century, most of whom accommodated the newly extended history of the earth into their faith. Charles Darwin did not lose his faith on account of evolution, or at least he didn't lose it exclusively because of evolution, and he explicitly denied that evolution was incompatible with theism right to his dying day. James Clerk Maxwell, on whose shoulders Einstein said he stood, was a devout evangelical, and even Einstein himself, while in no way believing in a personal God, was serious about the kind of quasi-religious metaphysics that he thought was behind the universe. I could go on, but hopefully you'll get the point that the idea that religion has relentlessly opposed and been antagonistic towards scientific progress over the years is simply not true. However, important to acknowledge, so is the idea that religion has always supported scientific developments and progress. It hasn't. A few more examples. The scientist in the Middle Ages was the Greek philosopher Aristotle, whom I've already mentioned. His work was introduced into European universities in the 13th century, and by the end of that century, the Bishop of Paris was banning it because he deemed its natural philosophy, its science, to be antagonistic to theology. In the 16th century, after Copernicus's theory of heliocentrism came to be known, Protestants, or some Protestants at least, pitted the book of Joshua, in which the sun is said to stand still, against Copernicus, and they found Copernicus wanting. The Catholic Church did ban Galileo's ideas, and it did ban the teaching of heliocentrism for nearly 200 years. The French Church, in particular, in the 18th century, really sought to suppress new biological ideas for fear of what they might do to the idea that God created life. Many people in the 19th century did consider geology to be unbiblical, end of. And Darwin was roundly attacked and trolled by many angry clerics. In other words, as you might expect really, because history is complex, the long interaction between science and religion has been much more complicated and much more nuanced than either the old conflict narrative allows us to believe, or the alternative harmony in the Garden of Eden narrative allows us to believe. And that's part of the problem. Because the best that academics have come up with as a metaphor or a narrative to replace the idea of conflict is complexity. And while complexity is undoubtedly more accurate than conflict, it's not exactly more gripping. Conflict, as we all know, sells. Complexity bores. One academic put it this way, that the so-called complexity thesis has literally nothing to recommend it except the truth. So, should we simply give up and acknowledge this is all just a mess? Well, having dismantled the idea of warfare, do we have anything at all to put in its place? Well, I argue in Magisteria and in another book that I've got coming out next year that I'll mention a little bit at the end that we do. And in order to explain what we do, I want to return back to our little vignette in 1860 when Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Huxley are taking chunks out of one another in front of an overexcited Victorian audience. Now, I mentioned earlier that frustratingly, we don't have any extensive or reliable sources for what went on in that fight. But that actually changed a few years ago. At the moment, you see Victorian periodicals and local newspapers are being digitized. And one keen-eyed American scholar noticed during this digitization a previously unknown and remarkably full account of the debate between Wilberforce and Huxley that was published in the Oxford Chronicle and Berks and Bucks Gazette, a great read. And this was clearly the source text for what had heretofore been the best account of the debate in the Athenaeum, but the Gazette offered a much more detailed account of the event, not to mention a rather charming one as well, in which it regularly interjects a running commentary on the crowd's response to these two great behemoths squaring up against one another. But importantly, it helps us get a better understanding of what actually went on. In the first instance, it shows us what exactly the big fuss had been about. At one point, attempting to interject some levity into what was turning out to be a pretty dull, hot afternoon, Wilberforce asked Huxley if he had any particular predilection for a monkey ancestry, and if so, on which side. Would he prefer an ape for his grandfather and a woman for his grandmother, or a man for his grandfather and an ape for his grandmother? In effect, this dignitary of the established church had asked Huxley in front of nearly 1,000 people which of his grandparents he would have preferred to have had sex with a monkey. Wisely, once his opponent had gone so low, Huxley went high. He replied, if the alternative were given him of being descended from a man conspicuous for his talents and eloquence, but who misused his gifts to ridicule the laborious investigators of science and to obscure the light of scientific truth, or from the humble origin alluded to, he would far rather choose the latter than the former. To which, according to the Gazette, there was much laughter and cheering. All good knockabout fun. More importantly, the transcript also shows what was at stake in the debate and how preoccupied the debate was by two other matters. The first was the question of the nature and the dignity of human beings. Now, interestingly, Samuel Wilberforce was willing to countenance the idea of evolution in some limited circumstances, but he did not. He could not extend that to human beings. And the way he used almost hysterically emotive language here showed how much this was the issue for him. I quote, "It is a most degrading assumption that man, who in many respects partook of the highest attributes of God, was a mere development of the lowest forms of creation. He could scarcely trust himself to speak upon the subject, so indignant did he feel at the idea." Huxley was able to respond to this successfully, as we can today. But for all that Wilberforce's objections were both scientifically and theologically wrong, it's nonetheless worth remembering his concern about what would happen to our concept of humanity if the only legitimate understanding of that humanity was judged to be that which came from evolution or biology. And I'll come back to that in a minute. For Huxley, the real debate was about another matter altogether. It was about authority. Huxley had begun his contribution by, quote, alleging the undesirability of contesting a scientific subject involving nice shades of ideas before a general audience. In other words, scientists shouldn't be casting their pearls before a swinish audience like this one. It was not, you would have thought, a foolproof tactic for winning over your audience. More tellingly, he was indignant that an amateur clerical naturalist like Wilberforce should consider himself capable of adjudicating on these matters. And he protested against this subject being dealt with by amateurs in science. Now, this was a very big issue at the time. If you wanted to find someone doing science at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a good chance you would find it with an Anglican cleric. Anglican cleric dominated the British Association for the Advancement of Science and were a major presence in the Royal Society, and they had powered much of British natural philosophy, as science was properly called, in the 18th century, which is another example, as it happens, of how science and religion got on very well. But things were changing. The word scientist was coined in 1834, and the role was slowly professionalized over the middle third of the century. Huxley was particularly active in this endeavor, and he was indignant that amateurs like Wilberforce should adjudicate on the matter. Although, as he rightly suspected, Wilberforce, being an amateur, had been coached by one of the best anatomists of the day. Either way, for all the hullabaloo, deep down, this science and religion debate was about humanity and about authority. And when science and religion have come into tension throughout history, and I would emphasize that on balance, that's an exception rather than the rule, they have disagreed over matters of authority. In other words, who gets to adjudicate on the nature of reality? And they've disagreed on matters of humanity. What kind of thing is a person? And when those two themes come together, as they did in Oxford in 1860, then there are fireworks. So, how do we respond to that? Well, there are various ways. One is to go, as it were, wholesale for the religion side. Ignore the science, follow the religion. And you force science into some kind of Procrustean scriptural bread. As it happens, and despite how much airtime fundamentalism gets in the press and how young earth creationism is a growing phenomenon, that's been a relatively rare and unusual and quintessentially modern response. And either way, it is one that, in my humble opinion, has nothing whatsoever to recommend it. But a second response is to say, forget the religion and, to adapt a phrase, follow the science. Indeed, forget anything else and follow the science, because science is truth, and truth, scientific truth, must always win. Might sound sensible at first, but I would humbly suggest that anyone who thinks that science, and by that I mean a process of objective hypothesis, observation, experimentation, replication, prediction, and so forth, and anyone who thinks that that can adjudicate definitively on questions of, say, ethics or values or aesthetics or the humanities, they're being a bit hopeful. You only have to look at the story of scientific racism in the 19th and 20th centuries to get nervous about the idea that science alone can proclaim authoritatively on human nature. One little example to explain why that's the case. In 1906, Ota Benga, a 23-year-old Congolese pygmy, was put on display in the New York Monkey House. Many speculated that he might be the famously elusive missing link between humans and other primates. He was put forward, in other words, as a living example of evolution. Now, we recognize today, of course, that this was simply vile nonsense. But at the time, it was considered science. And the people loved it. And thousands of people visited Ota Benga in his cage. And interestingly, it was the Coloured Baptist Ministers' Conference, led by the Reverend James Gordon, who led the protests against Otter Benga being imprisoned in a cage for scientific reasons, complaining that, quote, "We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls." Now, talk of souls was hardly going to persuade the scientifically minded men who had put Otter Benga in the monkey house. But that was nonetheless how Gordon chose to argue his case. And in the end, he won. In other words, simply, blindly saying, follow the science, is as short-sighted as simply, blindly saying, follow the religion. A few years ago, the American evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould tried to cut this particular Gordian knot with his idea of NOMA as a kind of a third way between the follow the science, follow the religion bits of the debate. NOMA stands for non-overlapping magisteria. And he used it to indicate the idea that deep down, science and religion represented different intellectual endeavors. One was about facts, the other was about values, and that each one was legitimate, but that neither encroached upon or overlapped with the other. Now, there's a certain neatness to the idea, which is one of the reasons why it has been widely poo-pooed. After all, reality doesn't divide neatly, and few people genuinely think you can split facts and values in that way. But I think there's something that can be salvaged from it, which is the idea of separate magisteria. As I've said, if you think your religion can tell you how the elements are structured in the periodic table or how the continents drifted across the Earth's surface, you're going to be disappointed. Just as if you think science can determine for you what kind of ethical system or approach to values or morality you should adopt. Again, if you think that, you're going to be disappointed. Science and religion are different disciplines, if that's the right word. What Stephen Jay Gould got wrong with his idea, albeit born from good intentions, was that these separate disciplines or separate magisteria didn't overlap. They do. And they overlap in particular when it comes to our ideas of what or who is a human and how do we know. Let me put it this way. If you want to understand the behavior of carbon atoms or tectonic plates or the function of the liver or the path of comets or the expansion of the universe, you need to do so objectively and ideally through experimentation and repetition and falsification. It would be a fundamental mistake to try and understand those things in personal or subjective or what philosophers call intentional ways. However, if you try and understand a human being in those objective or experimental or replicable terms, you're going to end up objectifying them. And you might end up experimenting on them. You might even end up putting them in cages. And more to the point, if you do that, you won't even understand them. Because if you want to know a person fully, to know them, you've got to do so in personal, subjective, intentional terms. You've got to treat them not as an object to be studied, but as a subject, because they, like you, are a subject. A simpler way of putting this is to borrow from the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who talked about different ways of knowing and relating. You can know something as an it, I, it, first person, third person. And there are many, many things in this world carbon atoms, tectonic plates, livers, comets, that should be known as its. But you can also know an entity as a you, I, you, first and second person. You can try and know a person as an it, as a something, but in doing so, you will never know them fully, only in part. You'll only know about them, you won't know them. To know a person, you have to know them as a you, as a someone, not a something. Science is the discipline of knowing it, objectively studying things. Religion is the arena of knowing yous, of coming into true, deep knowledge of personal beings. I want to clarify a couple of things before I close. First is that I don't mean to say in any of this that only religions or only religious people see people as subjects rather than objects. That obviously isn't the case. Rather, what I'm saying is that religions operate on a different level to science. And in that regard, Stephen Jay Gould is right. They are different magisteria, but that they overlap. And in particular, they overlap not in necessarily a conflictual way, but in a way that enriches the way we understand the world about us. And here's why I will come into land. I think that this is going to become an increasingly important area in the 21st century. I ended Magisteria with a short section on AI. And even in the year and a half since I wrote that, things have developed enormously. But it's not just AI. I've got a short book coming out next year called Playing God, which has a chapter on AI. But it's also got a chapter on genetic engineering. It has a chapter on the question of animal personhood, which is the movement there is, particularly in the US, but not just in the US, to recognize the rights, the personhood of intelligent animals other than humans. So there's an elephant in the zoo in New York, I think it is, who is rather misleadingly known as Happy, although it hasn't been a particularly happy legal experience for Happy, for whom the animal rights, the animal personhood group have repeatedly taken to court to ask for the courts to recognize the personhood of Happy. And they've tried the same approach for dolphins and other species that are clearly intelligent. There is, as we speak, in America, billionaires pouring vast sums of money into the quest for what you might call scientific immortality, or more prosaically, extreme longevity. The idea that we could live for hundreds of years, which seems nonsensical to us, but when you think about the fact that if you were to scroll back to the beginning of the 20th century, the average life expectancy for somebody in the UK was about 43 years. That almost doubled in the 20th century. And there are strong attempts to double it again in the 21st century. If you've watched the news recently, you'll have picked up increasingly endless speculation about the possibility of life on other planets. What would happen to our sense of the human if we finally get a signal telling us that there are other intelligent life forms around? We might come on to this in the Q&A. Statistically, I think that's almost a certainty, but whether we actually ever make contact with them is another matter. The point about all these is that these are all developments in different scientific disciplines which are encroaching on the question of what it means to be a human. Are humans in any way distinct from other species? Would we be in any way demoted or different from intelligent aliens? Where does the boundary of human nature lie when it comes to extending our lives, or modifying us genetically, or uploading us into some kind of tech hybrid, etc., etc., etc. All these are questions that are bringing in, all these are scientific areas that are bringing into question the issue of what it means to be a human. And that is fundamentally, I would argue, a religious question. At very least, it's a philosophical question, but really, it's deep down, it's a religious question, not least because for so many people in the world, the idea of what our humanity is predicated on the Judeo-Christian view of us being made in the image of God. So my whole kind of purpose of engaging with this area, I mean, I find the history, as you will have picked up, I find the history fascinating. There are some great stories there. There are some important myths that need to be bust, and there are some beautiful and profound truths that need to be brought to light. But it's not just history. In fact, history is never just history. That speaks directly to our current concerns. And you don't have to have, a religious faith to be increasingly anxious that the speed with which the technological advances are being made and the logic of market competitiveness that is driving forward these scientific endeavors are leaving the ethical and existential questions a long way behind. And I think this is where this long-standing, interesting debate between science and religion can really speak into a live issue, rather than focusing on some of the issues that I do think are interesting, but ultimately are peripheral. What matters, and what will matter more and more in the 21st century, is how do we understand our humanity and who gets to say. Thank you very much indeed.